Thank you. All right. So welcome on to this Q&A. Again, want to welcome on to this Q&A. There was a question came up earlier. Someone asked, whatever, interesting question. I think actually all questions are interesting. And the question was divine providence, what we call hashgacha pratis, or if you want to pronounce it yeshivish, we'll call it hashgacha pratis. Divine providence, who does that apply to? Does that apply to Jews? Does that apply? Well, it certainly applies to Jews. That there's no question. We see that. We see that God intervenes in history. We see that God took the Jewish people out of Egypt. So that certainly would apply to Jews. I mean, they weren't Jews at the time, but you could argue, since they weren't Jews at the time, maybe it applies to all Jews, all people, right? Not just Jews, meaning Jews and non-Jews, or does it? That was the question. Does it really apply to non-Jews? The side question or follow-up question would be, does it apply also to every Jew? Right? If we're going to say it applies to Jews, that's for sure. It does apply to Jews. Question is everybody. What about evil people that are Jewish? Or does it only apply to the righteous? Right? So, first of all, divine providence, or hashgacha pratit, or hashgacha pratis as it is called, right? It's not limited, not only limited to Jews, but it's not only limited to people. Why? Because God is in charge of every single physical entity, right? The small subatomic particles, the largest galaxies, black holes, right? Let's say God's in charge of all this, right? Of every big thing, every tiny thing, right? Every element in the world only exists because God gives it the existence, right? Now the question would be, okay, if it's in existence, is it because the life force is from God? And if that's true, well, what about bad things? So do we include evil people in such a case? Do we say suffering or things that go against God, right? Let's say, right? So seemingly the Chos of Ovos and due to the heart, Shar B'tachon, third chapter, says that all human beings are included in divine providence, i.e., Jews, right, and non-Jews, because the Chos of Ovos says that he directs the lives of all men, right? He doesn't abandon any of them, does not neglect them, and no thing that anybody does, Jew or non-Jew, will distract God or will be hidden, right, from him, right? And we have different proofs in the prophets that certainly say that. So very clear, according to the Chos of Avos. Yeah, it's talking about everybody, right? In other words, divine providence even exists by non-Jews. Now, Rav Dessler um, also seems to say that as a person, if a person sees themselves, as part of the divine plan, yeah, they merit divine providence. Yeah, that's what Rav Dessler says. Meaning, if a person wouldn't do that, then providence will be part of the group to which they belong. In other words, there are two things in divine providence, quoting Rav Dessler. One is what we call hashgacha pratis, or hashgacha pratit, i.e. divine providence for the individual. And he says the opposite of that is what we call hashgacha klalis. What's hashgacha klalis? Divine providence for the group. So Rav Dessler learns if a person is part of a certain group, even maybe if they don't merit divine providence, they could merit it through being part of a part of a group. So it would seem that according to this, non-Jews are included, right? So divine providence would also be through non-Jews as well, right? In other words, that would apply as well. So that was the first part of the question, and then he asks, oh, that was the question. That was the question I got, but someone asked further that does it only apply to righteous people, right? Maybe you'll say, well, it should only apply to people that keep what he says. Yeah, what about someone who's evil? What about, God takes care of them also. So maybe by someone who's evil, we won't say that. Maybe they lose this aspect of divine providence. Maybe they're only part of what we call hashgacha klalit. If they belong to a group, they identify, let's say, with a group. So very interesting. So what's the answer? That we see the Choshen says further in Shar B'tachon. He says, what happens if a person trusts in God and goes against him? Essentially rebels. Now, we're not talking about the question of free will. Free will is a different question. Because basically everybody has free will. Right? Everyone has an evil inclination. They can choose to do the right thing, the wrong thing. Right? Jews and non-Jews. The question by free will, which we're not really going to get into, but the question is, how much free will does the person really have? If God's really orchestrating things anyway, how much free will do I have? So you say, what do you mean? I have plenty of free will. I can decide to do something, not to do something, but either you put yourself in a certain situation, or God put you in that situation. The question's going to be, what is your reaction? Right? How are you going to get, around this, so to speak? That's right. That's the question by free choice. So seemingly free choice we have, right? No one's programmed. Everyone can decide to do whatever they want, right? A Jew can decide not to keep, anything or very few things or, whatever. He's got free choice, right? I think it's limited to a certain extent. So Ramchal says, and Derech Hashem, it is limited because a lot of things we're not in control of, right? Many things, most things we're not in control of. The only thing we are in control of in general is our reaction. How are we going to react to that? But the Chofetz says, very interesting, he says, let's say a person believes in God, trusts in God. Okay. And what if they rebel? Now, if they trust in God, so there should be divine providence, right? God should look after them and take care of them and all that. But what if they rebel? Does that mean automatically the rebellion takes away this divine help, right? This divine providence? Because essentially any transgression a person does is really a rebellion. You're going against what God says. You're going against what God wants. Very good. Yeah, or not so good, right? But that's what you're doing. So that's my Rabbi this once many years ago, that if a person does something wrong, in essence, it's a rebellion. Now, if it's a rebellion, right, if we're going to entertain that possibility, if it is a rebellion, yeah, then punishment is more severe because you are actively going against what God says, right? But most rebellion today is based on the fact that the person has a yitzhar, person has an evil inclination. So therefore, if a person has an evil inclination, technically you tell me it is a rebellion. Going against what God says is a rebellion, for sure, right? But why are they doing it? If they have all the answers, they know what they're doing, they have knowledge, they have Torah knowledge, Okay, right? If they don't have knowledge, meaning Torah knowledge, then it's their evil inclination, right? That's what's making them go astray. But even so, question is, says Chosavovos, if you trust in God and you rebel against Him, so he says the person's weak in intellect, he's weak in understanding, because if he sees in this world, and if an employer, let's say, is going to appoint somebody to do something or refrain from doing something, and the person says, no, I'm not going to do it. They are going to disobey the instruction, right? Okay. So if that works by an employer, what's going to happen? The employer says, I want you to do this, that, and the other thing, right? Part of your job, right? Let's say part of your job, and the employee says, I'm not doing it. He says, no, they refuse to do it. So if they refuse to do it, then the employer can turn around and refuse to fulfill his side of the deal. In other words, the employer told you to do this. That's part of your job description. You don't do it, so the employer can now renege or refuse to fulfill whatever he's supposed to do. All the more so if God gave the commandments and we're obligated to keep them. Yeah, very good. So God Himself says that one who trusts in Him, if you really believe in Him and you disobey Him, what's going to happen? His hopes are foiled, his trust will be considered hypocritical. In other words, God could say, why would I help you over here? You rebelled against me, right? There are consequences. There are repercussions for what I do. So what would God say? He's going to be like the one that Job himself says, chapter 27, verse 8 and 9. For what is the hope of flatterers who deceive when God casts off his soul? In other words, God got to hear his, well, let's say better. God says further over there, will God hear his cry when trouble comes upon him? Yeah, so what does that sound like? If you do what God says, you have divine providence. If you don't do what God says, seemingly not. Now the question is repentance. It depends what you did, depends how you did it, depends where you're holding in the world, depends on a lot of different things. Right? But it goes further. Is the person going to steal, murder, commit adultery, offer up idols, all these things, and then you're going to come and stand before God in his house, which my name is called, and said, we're saved, right? This is from Jeremiah chapter 7, right? Verses 9 to 11, right? So you're going to say, well, God saved me over here in order to commit all these abominations. So Jeremiah says, further, have this house upon which my name is called become a den of thieves in your eyes. So I do, behold, I've seen it. So says the Lord. So what does it sound like from Jeremiah? Ain't gonna happen. In other words, if you go against what God says, and he's talking about severe things. Steal, these are Noahide laws as well. Steal, murder, adultery, right? Forbidden relationships, swearing falsely, also very severe prohibition, one of the 10 commandments. Idolatry, etc. So if a person, so you tell me, well, maybe it depends on the severity of what you do. Yeah, if it's not so bad, not death penalty, not something you have to give up your life for, maybe we'll say, okay, it's a rebellion. Certainly not death penalty. But who says God's going to turn his back on you? Who says? Or you tell me no. Even if it's not death penalty, it's still a rebellion. And if it's still a rebellion, why should God help you? Right? Now, this is the miracle. This is the miracle of repentance, which we've spoken about. So I'm not gonna harp on it. Just mention one thing, right? And that is a person can spit in God's face and not do what he says. But as we always say, no atheist in a foxhole. When the chips are down, you have nowhere to turn. Yeah, a person all of a sudden's a believer and calls out to God to help him. Now, let's say Let's say a person did this to themselves. Yeah, they messed their own life up, whatever they did. Now, the Ramban, if I remember correctly, in the book of Job says, the person's going to say after 20 years, after they die, they're going to say, God, why'd you do this? And God's going to say, let's go back to the video here. I didn't do this. I didn't stop you. You went against Kaufman's 615th commandment. Don't be a moron. You did something stupid, right? Or the 614th commandment, don't be stupid. I didn't stop you. In this case, I didn't stop you. So why are you blaming me? These are the repercussions, right? These are the repercussions of your actions. But you can't say, the Ramban over there says, you don't have a claim to say it's your fault, right? You could have done this or you could have done that. God said, yeah, maybe I could have, but I didn't. I have to, I have to stop you when you're being reckless. I have to stop you when you put, your life in danger. Now, there are times God will do that, right? And God will save you. There are many times that a person doesn't even know that they were saved from, from certain disaster, whatever it may be. You don't even know, right? You won't even find out till after a person dies, and God will make clear. There are many things, right? That now could be the way it works is you could have lost some of your mitzvahs, right? In the process. Why? Because mitzvahs, when a person does mitzvahs, really, you're going to get part of that in the next world. Very good. But it could be, we look at mitzvahs sometimes like a person playing a video game, and they have extra lives. So they protect the person. So even if a person really should have got seriously injured, and they walk away without a scratch or very little. Now it could be, I'm not saying all the time it's going to be the case, but it could be a person uses up some of the merit of these mitzvahs, of some of the mitzvahs, because they protected him. In this case, they protected him from death, or something very severe. So therefore, it could get used up in this world. Some of them, maybe all of them. It depends, right? It depends what a person has done. So in that case, what can happen? Person's dangerous situation. They don't have too many extra lives, and their lives get taken. Right? Their lives get taken. Now, God looks, throughout their soul, what's going to come out of them, is going to be good for them, in future generations. It's not. I need them. I don't need them. God makes that choice. Whatever that choice is. Right? But I'll give a spin on it, as we mentioned this story before. The football player many years ago, probably more than 30 years ago for sure, that jumps in to save somebody is drowning. Or 2 or 3 people drowning. He himself didn't know how to swim so well. I think one or 2 people were saved, and he and someone else drowned. Now, this person was 20, I think like 28, 26, 27, 28. Forget exactly the age. He drowned. Now, this person, after he drowned, could have had a complaint and said, why didn't you save me? You could have saved me here. Right? Now, if I were playing God, put on my funny George Burns glasses and my funny mustache, what would I say? If I were playing God, he said, you're right, I could have saved you. I could have saved you. But, I looked deep into your soul, right? I saw, what potentially will or not come out of you, etc. But I didn't tell you to jump in. You wanted to be the hero, whatever. Your adrenaline was running. You didn't really know how to swim. So now I was 15 years old, in camp, learned, junior life saving. So, the main thing about saving a person is, if you jump in to save them, with clothes on, let's say, you have to know what you're doing. Because if you do not know what you're doing, if they're drowning, they are going to try and drown you in order for them to stay alive. So if you don't know what you're doing, you could possibly drown also. Right? But again, there are different techniques of how to do it, right? And, and how to save the person and, all that without being dragged under and actually drowning, right? So in this case, this person didn't have any training, doesn't sound like, had any training, and he jumped in when it was dangerous. Yeah. So you're not allowed to put yourself in a dangerous situation. If it's doubtful, it's a dangerous situation. Yeah, that's a different issue because it's not clear. It's not clear what could happen. Now, a person will say, but they're watching these people drown, they can't do anything. Right? If they don't jump in, for sure they're gonna drown. Okay, so then you get to the question, whose blood is redder? It's a terrible situation to be in. No one says not. Right? But whose blood is redder? Right? What does that mean? It means that you could die or they could die. But are you obligated to put yourself at risk for that? No. You're not. If it's a clear-cut danger, no. If it's not a clear-cut danger, okay. So not a clear-cut danger, then a person could. But in this case, God can say, I didn't tell you to jump. Maybe it was evil inclination, whatever. You want to be the hero, but you can't do something that puts your life in danger. Okay. Now, God could have saved him. God 100% could have saved him. Now, in order to be saved, in any of these situations, the person has to have merit. And in some cases, you have to have a lot of merits. Because if you don't have a lot of merits, i.e. mitzvahs to protect you, then what's going to happen? You will be laid out according to the elements. And what's going to happen in the elements in such a case? Yeah, you'll drown, right? Essentially, you'll drown. We're not talking about a case where, the current's very strong, you're trying to swim against the current. We're talking about a case you don't really know how to swim so well. Yeah, and the person jumps in. For whatever reason, the other person's drowning. Right, let's say no one should ever be in such a situation. But if this person doesn't have mitzvahs to protect them, let's say, we'll make it very simple. They have no mitzvahs to protect them, or very few. Then why should God save them? Right? It's the question if a person's drowning on Shabbos, can you save him? Right? Similar. Why? Why would you not have to save them? Well, let's say, what's the purpose of saving somebody? The Gemara says, the purpose of saving someone is that they're going to be able to keep future Shabbos. Right? In other words, you're going to save them because they're going to keep Shabbos. Right? That's the main frame here. That's the main idea. In other words, you're going to save them, the Gemara says, because in the future, they'll be able to keep Shabbos. Now, you obviously have to know if they keep Shabbos or not. Very good. So if it would be a non-religious person, technically, you wouldn't have to save them. There'd be no mitzvah to save them. Why? Because they don't keep Shabbos. Right? So you tell me, wait a minute, maybe they will. Maybe because they got saved, just the opposite. Maybe they'll be all caught up in emotion. They'll start looking into Judaism, and maybe they'll become religious. Okay, maybe. But I don't have to make that calculation. So the question there is, the answer in general is you have to save them anyway. Whether they're going to keep Shabbos or not. Right? That's how it comes out. But the Gemara goes back and forth. What's, if it's on Shabbos, what's the merit? What's the purpose, of saving them? What's the reason you would save them? Right? So Gemara makes very clear. The purpose is to keep future Shabbos. And if you know they don't keep Shabbos, so technically I wouldn't have to save them. Right? I wouldn't have to go in and save them. Right? Again, we're not talking about where it's a risk to life. Be a risk to life, no one would have an obligation. Right? So the question is, so the Gemara is going back and forth. Right? Going back and forth this whole question. And this is where the question comes up. Oh, but if you see a non-Jew drowning, you don't save him. Now again, what's the connection between a non-Jew and a Jew drowning on Shabbos? The same connection. The connection is, are they going to keep Shabbos or not? Non-Jews don't keep Shabbos. Right? Forbidden to keep Shabbos. Right? If they're in the process of conversion, different issue. But again, most non-Jews, right, they're certainly not going to convert. They don't keep Shabbos. Right? So people say, see? You have to save them anyway. That's how it comes out. But people will say, we'll quote this, and they'll say, look, there's a mitzvah not to save. There's an obligation not to save a non-Jew drowning on Shabbos. That wasn't even the question. Right? This is how people take it out of context. That was not even the question. That was just thrown out as a side question based on the fact that they don't keep Shabbos. Is it the same law? Does the same law apply? Right? If you were to tell me at the beginning the Gemara says, you're not allowed to save a non-Jew, and what's the reason? It goes through the whole thing. Okay, we can have a discussion, short discussion. Why did it start out with not saving a non-Jew? But that wasn't even the question. The question was, how am I allowed to save the Jew? Because if the Jew doesn't keep Shabbos, why would I save him? That's the whole point. He's going to keep future Shabbos. Then it says, oh, what about a non-Jew? Non-Jew's not in Shabbos. We just read last week's Torah portion. It says by Shabbos, oy seli oilam, beini u beincha, or beinam, whatever it is, between me and the Jewish people, God says. Doesn't say amongst non-Jews. Shabbos doesn't apply to non-Jews in general, right? So if that's the case, that's not even the question. That's not even the question of the Gemara. The Gemara throws that out at the end, right? So, I love people that cherry pick and they're going to say, see, you're not allowed to say, a non-Jew if he's drowning on Shabbos. Now, the halacha is not that way. The halacha is you have to say him anyway. Same too with the secular Jew. Okay. But that wasn't even the point, right? You have 20, 30 lines going back and forth about the whole thing, how you're allowed to save the Jew. That was the question. That was the main question. Throw in a little side point about a non-Jew because it's not included in Shabbos, so it's the same thing. So it really should be the same thing, right? That's how they take it out of context. But anyway, what's the point? The point is, if Torah is supposed to guard a person, right, then a person technically could lose some of their mitzvahs because instead of God, let's say, taking them, the mitzvahs protect them, they continue to live. But they could have died, right? And there are many, many cases like this. Someone gets in a car accident, let's say, God forbid. The car is totaled, right? Let's say the car is totaled and they come out like without a scratch. Or even if they get injured, whatever, they come out of it. They come out of it. Now, if you look at what happens, then you'll say, they should be dead, right? They absolutely should be dead, right? So a person has to recognize, certainly has to recognize that fact, right? But the second thing is, you have other people, let's say, get into less, not as severe, but they get killed. Now, why did they get killed? Because God took them. That's how He took them, right? They got killed. Okay, whatever, for whatever reason. Yeah, some people will survive, and it could be because they have the merit of Torah protecting them. And other people will die because God's going to take them anyway, and that's how He did it. So we don't understand all these or many of these calculations, but it could be, right? It very well could be if someone puts their life in danger, and they rebel against God and they don't care. So now they get into this idea of what Rav Dessler calls hashgacha klalis. In other words, if they're part of a group, you can also have divine providence over here. And if they're not, then they're left to nature. They're left to the elements. Now, if a person would be left to the elements in such a case, yeah, they are left to the elements. What are the odds if they rebel against God, they don't keep what He says? What are the odds that they are going to be saved? So you tell me, it depends on the elements, right? Maybe they'll drown, maybe they won't drown, right? Someone's going to say, if God sees everything, He'll either allow it or not, okay. But if we're going to say that person doesn't have direct, if he's not associated with any group, so he doesn't have direct providence over here, what's going to be the bottom line? The bottom line is, what's nature going to do over here? This guy jumps in, So you have three other people there, all flapping around, drowning. So what happens? He's able to save one or two of them, but as he's trying to save them, the others are dragging him down. So he doesn't have all the strength in the world, right? Not Superman over here. He doesn't have all the strength in the world. He's able to save, let's say 2 people, but at the same time, he gets weaker, he gets pulled down, and he ends up drowning. Yeah. So in the end, the elements took him. Now, why would I say that? Because anyone's ever taken, let's say, a life-saving course, or anyone's ever done this, they know this is dangerous. If you jump in, you have to know what you're doing. If you do not know what you're doing, then chances are, very good chance, what could happen is you're trying to save the person, They're grabbing onto you for dear life, and they're dragging you under while trying to keep themselves afloat. Now, if that's the case, what can happen is, you get weaker, a person can drown. Easily, a person can drown. Right? So in that case, maybe it depends on the weather, it depends on the wind, it depends what clothing you're wearing, it depends how many people are there. I mean, it could depend on a lot of different factors, right? It could depend on a number of different factors. But if you have a number of factors, let's say against you, right? In the elements, right? You got a wind factor. Yeah, you have a number factor here, right? Number of people trying to push you down in order to push themselves up, right? And all that. So you have a number of factors. Now the question is, are the elements going to be very hard to overcome, like seemingly impossible to overcome? Or is it going to be that the person, even through the elements, will be able to persevere, they'll have this adrenaline going, and they'll be able to, save them and save themselves, right? So what's the answer? We don't know. We don't know what's going to happen, but if a person knows they're not a very strong swimmer, yeah, and if they know, even better, they don't necessarily know how to swim so well. So the elements are a major factor here, right? They are a major factor. And that could be the difference between whether they live or they die. Now, they may not care. They may just jump in. So at the end of the day, God's going to call it. God is going to judge it. Now, if someone, dies doing that, what's everyone going to say? He's a hero. Everyone's going to say he's a hero. Give him a hero's funeral. Look what he did. He jumped in, tried to save lives. Right? Put his life at risk to save lives. I'm saying God could look at it and say, no. This person's not a martyr over here. Right? This person's an idiot. Why is he an idiot? Because he jumped in, went against the elements, didn't really know how to swim so well, and put his whole life in danger. And that the Torah says you're not allowed to. Now, what if a person did it? Right? Let's say person not thinking, adrenaline's flowing, it's cousins, loved ones, whoever it is, and they jump in. Now everyone's going to say it's meritorious. Who's going to say it's not meritorious? They're trying to save lives. Okay. But at the same time, if you know it's a danger, you got to be very careful doing it. Because otherwise, that could be looked at as suicide. You're going to say, what do you mean suicide? Person's not going there to die. Right? That's not their intention. Their intention is trying to save a person's life. Very good. Right? So that's a great intention. Right? The only problem is there are too many factors against where the person jumps in. The odds are, the odds are not 50-50 here. Right? The odds are much less. Much, much less. So therefore, a person jumps in. I understand why they would do it. I'm not saying not. Right? And people say it's admirable and everything else. That is true to a point. But if you're going in against all these different elements where, most of the time you will not be successful coming out, then you're not allowed to put yourself in that situation. Right? That could be looked at. I'm not saying it is 100%, but that could be looked at 100% as suicide. You put yourself in danger, and there was no possible way you could come out of it. No possible way. Right? We'll make it even better. Yeah, let's say the tide is very strong. Right? And these people are being carried out. Carried out with the tide. And they're slowly going under. And they're trying to fight it. So the person jumps in. Okay. But if the person jumps in and they don't know how to swim so well, what's going to happen? What are the odds they're going to get, thrown underwater also? Probably very good. Yeah, probably very good. Even if a person's a good swimmer. I know a story, tragic story. Husband and wife went, on a vacation. They went to a secluded area, whatever. Husband was a very good swimmer. Goes out to swim in this area, no lifeguard, no nothing. Okay. Yeah, and what happens? There's a very strong undertow that they didn't know. Now, the person's a very good swimmer. Extremely good swimmer. And what happened? He drowned. Yeah, he drowned in the undertow. Now, you're going to say, how do you know this undertow? You didn't know, right? But I'm saying, in the best of circumstances, if there's a very strong undertow that's pulling someone under, it's going to be very hard to fight against that, even if you're a good swimmer. Now, what if you're not such a good swimmer? Yeah, or you barely know how to swim? What's that undertow going to do? It's going to kill you, most likely. Could a person be saved? Yes. Could God save them? Yes. But if you're out against the elements and you don't have merit to save you, or that's the way God's going to take you, then that's what's going to happen. Now, this person drowned, was a religious Jew. So you ask, what happened? Didn't he have, mitzvahs to save him? Could have. Probably should have. You would assume that, a person doing mitzvahs day in and day out. I'm not saying the person's evil by any stretch. Yeah. They should have mitzvahs to be able to protect them under, in certain circumstances. Okay. Why didn't it protect him over here? Don't know. Yeah, God didn't protect him. God did not save him. Why didn't he save him? If I knew that, I wouldn't be doing what I was doing. I'd be famous, right? I'd be a prophet, right? We don't know. We don't know how these things work. But I would say, if someone doesn't have any merit or very little merit, then why would God save them? God can say, okay, you lived a certain, amount of years, no purpose in his life anymore. So, okay. So you're going to go according to the elements. And if the elements take you, they take you. Right? You can't complain. You can't complain to me afterwards and say, why don't you save me? Because what is God going to say? If I were playing God, I'd say very simple. What are you doing? No one told you to jump. Right? No one told you to try and save these people. You never took a life-saving course in your life. You jumped in. Adrenaline told you to jump in. Okay. Yeah, but you're against the elements. And the elements are too great for a person to overcome. No matter how strong you are, this and that. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing, they pull you down. Right? That's like the first thing you learn, in life-saving course like this. You don't jump in if you don't know what you're doing. You have to know what you're doing. Otherwise, what's going to happen? They will drown you, right? So different positions to take them in, and there's a lot of different things to do, right? To mitigate the danger, right? To mitigate the danger that you are going to drown, right? If you're not trained in this or you're not a good swimmer, I'm not going to say 100% the person's going to drown, right? But there's a good chance. There's a good chance. Now, shouldn't the person have merit to save them? Maybe. Maybe they should. Why didn't God save them? He didn't save them. Yeah, that's how he took them. But God didn't say, go jump in there and do it. Right? He knows what's going to happen anyway. Right? He understands what's going to happen anyway. So it could be the evil good agent convinced him to do it. That's how, God gave the green sign, convinced him to do it. He jumped in. That's how he took him. Right? But at the end of the day, we don't know. Right? At the end of the day, we don't know. So the question, back to this question is, why, why should God save the person? Now, we certainly believe that even if a person does something to themselves, they made a serious mistake themselves. Now, even if they made a serious mistake themselves, and God didn't stop them, then they still have the ability to pray that God should help them, take them out of it. Now, what could God easily say? As we said many times before, God could easily say, I didn't tell you to do this. I didn't convince you to go down this path. So God could look down and say, I'm not helping you. Right? Whatever happens according to nature is going to happen. Now, God could say that. Now, can God have compassion? Yes. Can you ask God to have compassion even though you yourself did something stupid? Yes. You can still do that. Right? The question is God going to listen or not? Right? In other words, we have something over here that is, as the Chofetz says, is hypocritical. Totally hypocritical. Yeah. In other words, a person's doing something wrong. Right? As he says in the book of Job, is there going to be hope for the flatterer deceives when God casts off his soul? God sees what he's doing. It's very clear what he's doing. Yeah. So why is God going to hear his cry? as it says in the book of Job, when trouble comes upon him, why should you listen? You did it to yourself, right? You are a liar, deceiver, whatever the person did wrong, doesn't matter. Yeah, you are now crying out for help for something that God said, why should I help you? Why in the world should I help you? You did it to yourself. I should listen. Goes further. The prophet Jeremiah says, yeah, you're going to steal, murder. I mean, you're going to do terrible things. You got to do, idolatry, right? These things that you have to give up your life for rather than transgress them. And, all of a sudden you're going to say, well, we're saved in order to commit all these abominations. You're hypocrites. You do all these terrible things and say, God should save me? Why should God save you? Why in the world should he save you? Yeah. Now, it doesn't mean that a wicked person, should have trust in God. God's going to provide for his livelihood, right? In other words, he's doing terrible things, so God's going to provide. Right? It's also foolish. But as we always say, there's no atheist in a foxhole. So even if a person does the wrong thing, yeah, even if they do the wrong thing, they still have the ability to pray that God should help them. Now, is God going to help them? It depends, right? It depends. Achav is getting boiled alive. He calls out to every idol. Every single idol he calls out to. Nobody answers. He says, all right, God, you're the last one. God, the Jewish people, I'm calling out to you. God looked down, he saved him. Because he called out to him. He didn't have to. He could have just let him fry. But the fact that he acknowledged him and he admitted that all the idolatry, all the idols have no power except for God himself. God, if you're really that powerful, show me this, that. God says, okay. Yeah, he didn't have to do that. He certainly didn't have to. He could have let him fry for what he did. Easily. And most of us probably, if we were playing God, we would have done it. Let him fry. You're calling out to me now? Now you're being fried alive? Yeah, you're calling out to me? Too late. Game over. Right? You're going to be a shish kebab. Right? That's it. You feel like what a lobster feels like. Get boiled alive. Yeah, that's what's going to happen. But the fact that he admitted these idols don't have any power, God have mercy. It's a mind-boggling thing. Similar thing that the Egyptians admit that God is fighting against them. For that reason, that the Torah says in the Song of the Sea, they get spit out on the dry land. Why do they get spit out on dry land? Why in the world do they get spit out on dry land? Right? The commentaries say because God, since they admitted God was fighting against them, and they admitted he was a true God, so instead of being fish food, like Bin Laden, instead of being fish food, God took these corpses and threw them on the sand, so they could be buried. What we've said, let them be fish food. Let the fish eat them. They have plenty of food. They have plenty of food for I don't know, decades. They could have so much food. All these bodies, tremendous amount of food for a long time. Oh, but they admitted God is fighting against them. And they admitted God is the true God after everything they did. To the Jewish people in Egypt, they deserve to die. Okay? They deserve to die. Very clear. But they also, because they admitted God was in charge, what happened? They had the merit to be buried. A mind-boggling thing. Nobody would have said such a thing. God has that kind of mercy. Right? I'll give you another example. Right? I'll take some questions in a second. Another example, we take Nebuzaradan. Nebuzaradan was the butcher of Baghdad, or Babylonia, let's say. Right? So he killed tens of thousands of people. And he repented. He repented for what he did with all the people that he killed. And he fled and he converted to Judaism. So every Tisha B'Av, when I go through this Gemara in Gittin, where, it talks about what happened, destruction of the temple. I always ask the same question. Why did God allow him to convert? You even see the great-grandkids of Haman, of all people, were sitting learning Torah B'nai Brak. Mind-boggling. Yeah, why let them convert? Why do you think someone who killed so many people, You let them convert? That's my question every year, the same question. And the answer is always the same. Anyone can come back. Anyone has the ability to come back, even if someone has done the worst thing. They have the ability to come back. And he allows them to come back, right? If they're sincere. So you take someone who butchered and slaughtered, thousands of people, and the fact that he had remorse, regret for what he did, to the extent where now he wants to join his lot with the Jewish people, God says, okay, we're going to let you join, right? Any base they're going to let this, imagine Hitler Yamach Shemov Yisrael killed millions. Killed millions, right? May name be brought up, may rot wherever he is. Imagine if he had remorse or regret during the war. Yeah, he stops what he's doing. He stops everything, and he comes in front of a base thing, in front of a biblical court, and says, I want to convert. I see the ways of the Jewish people are righteous, and whatever, regardless, he killed millions, or ordered the killing of millions. If he would come and convert. He didn't. Thank God. But imagine if he would have had to regret or remorse. Any base isn't going to take him? They should take him and allow him to convert? It didn't happen, so it doesn't matter. But you see by Nupusa Rad, then he was allowed to convert. A mind-boggling thing. Right? So even if someone goes against God, they can still have, what we call hashgacha klalis. They can have, general, if they identify with a group, they can have general, what do you call it? General, general providence, let's say. Individual providence be another thing, right? That would be another thing, right? But they could have, so that goes on to something else. But a non-Jew in general, why not? Why should that not be the case, right? Why should that be any different? In other words, they should be able to have divine providence as well, right? What is going to happen? So the question comes, what's going to happen if they don't do the right thing and they go against God or whatever? So that's the whole question, right? That's the whole question, how God is going to deal with them, right? But as the prophet Jeremiah says, what? You're going to commit all these transgressions. You're going to do all these terrible things. Now you're going to come back to me and say, I have salvation. And that you're going to save me, I'm going to have a portion of the world to come. That doesn't make any sense, logically. Should not make any sense. The idea of repentance, as we always say, is not logical. God says, I'm going to uproot what you did. You did the wrong thing, but you're so much closer to me that it makes no sense according to humanistic terms. In humanistic terms. If someone wronged us, even if it's something relatively small, their relationship is never the same, normally. I'm not going to say all the time, but normally. If it's something egregious, you have nothing to do with them. That's not taking revenge. That's not bearing a grudge. You can't trust them. Right? Somebody you can't trust. You can't trust. Right? You can't hate them. It's forbidden to hate them in your heart. It's forbidden to bear a grudge. At the same time, if they're not trustful, I don't have to trust them. If they have a track record, I can guard myself against them for sure. Yeah, so in that case, right? In that case, what happens? They're going to call to God to save them. So why would God save them? Then what the prophet says. Why would God save them? It's a total contradiction. It's total hypocrisy. Total hypocrisy. You want the best of both worlds. But guess what? God can save them. He's asking the question, why should he? Makes sense? 60, 70 years, you spit in his face, and all of a sudden, a person got dreaded disease, who knows what, and a person cries out to God, save him. Yeah, take it away. Help them, whatever it is. Yeah, and what happens? He can do it. He can do it. Why would he do it? Because he has mercy. Should he do it? Right? That's exactly what Jeremiah says. Why should you do it? Why in the world should you do it? He doesn't have any merit. He's got no merit over here. But the fact that he recognizes there's no other hope in the world, and you are the one that's in charge, that's a huge thing. You see that by the Egyptians. The Egyptians almost caused the Jewish people to go into spiritual oblivion, right? There are 49, they're 50 gates of impurity. They hit the 49th level. Yeah, whatever that means. One level more, had they been impure, they would have been obliterated spiritually. They didn't just hit them spiritually, they hit them physically, They suffered in so many different ways, right? And you're going to allow them because they admit that God, the true God of the world, is fighting against them. That gives them the ability to be buried. It's mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. Nobody, logically speaking, no one would say that. They say Bin Laden, fish, fish food, right? Let them be eaten by the fish. Yeah, plenty of years, fish food. No, they got spit out on the dry land for the sole reason, or at least one reason, I think it's the main reason, that they admitted God was fighting against them. So therefore they deserve to be buried. It's mind-boggling. Nobody in their right mind would ever say such a thing. Nobody. You need God of the Jewish people, God of the world to say it. Otherwise, Cotman's language, you got to say, you got to get off the cotton picking head. It makes no sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. Right? I remember I came across this. I read it once, I read it twice, I read it 5 times. And I'm like, you got to be kidding. You got to be kidding. This you're going to allow. Right? But the same thing. Well, that Gemara by Nebuza Radin. I'm like, no, change it. Erase it. Tell me he died 50 different ways. When he suffered and they plucked his toenails one by one and they made him totally suffer. Everyone's gonna be like, yeah, let him suffer. Give it to him more. Hang him by his nose, whatever. Give him whatever he deserves. 100%. You're gonna let him convert and be part of the Jewish people and allow him to count in a minion? And you have to get him kosher food? Seriously? Make no sense. Makes no sense, right? But it does. Why? Because God is mercy. Anyone who wants to come, they can join. No matter what they've done. It's unbelievable, right? Nobody in the right mind would say such a thing, right? So someone asks, okay, let's deal with this. Is a valid conversion if God makes someone sick and they convert out of fear? No, not valid. Now, how do I know? That was one of my questions that I asked on Purim. And where do you see in the book of Esther about conversion? So you see in the last chapter, second to last chapter, chapter 8, verse 17. Right, it says that they were converts. And at the end of the verse, it says they converted out of fear. So the Gemara says on that, they converted out of fear. You cannot convert for ulterior motives. You can't convert because, let's say the time of King David, King Solomon, no one can convert because there are open miracles. In the time of the Messiah coming, you can't convert because there'll be open miracles. But you can convert because of fear. What were they afraid of? The Jews were going to come and annihilate them, right? That was the decree that Mordechai had signed, right? And Mordechai had written up and signed with the king's seal. So I was listening to Rabbi before Purim, blessed memory, and he spoke, and he was saying that one of the biggest miracles, if not almost the biggest miracle in the whole story of Purim, is the fact that the nations allowed Jews to slaughter these people and defend themselves. I shouldn't say slaughter, defend themselves. Right? 75,000 people, non-Jews, were killed by Jews defending themselves. Imagine that went on today. Imagine, back in my alma mater, Columbia University, imagine someone, a Jew wasn't allowed to go to class. They barricaded, they weren't allowed to go to class. This person takes out a gun and starts shooting people. You think for 1 second they're going to allow them to do it and take revenge because, they're being bullied and attacked and different things? Can't imagine, right? You have law of the land also, but it's what Rabbi said, and I've said it many times, and he's probably the one I heard it from, right? And that is 75,000 non-Jews were killed, and then no one batted an eyelash. They had a right to do it. Absolutely had a right to do it. So why were they going to convert? Because they were afraid. Because they were absolutely afraid. Very good. They're absolutely afraid. So the Gemara says on that, is that a good conversion? No. Can't convert out of fear. You want to convert because the God of Israel is a true God, right? You want to keep all the commandments. You want to be obligated. That's it. No ulterior motives. Not because of fear. Not because, eventually they're going to rebuild the temple and we're going to be up here and everyone else is either going to be destroyed or, be much lower. Much lower. Okay. Right? But you're not converting for that. Right? That would be forbidden. Any ulterior motive. Right? Even out of fear. So fear is going to be forbidden, right? So now the question is, what does the Torah say about conversion? Not very much. Don't say anything direct. right? It talks about converts, does not say the conversion process. Doesn't, you see by Book of Ruth. Book of Ruth talks about conversion, but doesn't say what she did. Right? And there are a lot of questions. If you're going to say she's a convert, there are many questions throughout the story. That seems to allude to the fact that she wasn't a convert. So the question is exactly what the level of conversion, was and how it worked. But everyone agreed that she converted, right? But the status of King David was called into question for that reason, right? For that reason. So Ruth had to have some level of conversion because Ruth is a Moabite. So even if you want to say it doesn't matter according to Ruth, if King David's mother was Jewish, then that's good enough. But the problem is, anytime a Moabite married and had children, whether the Moabite was a woman or a man, it was kind of like a dominant gene. It's passed down all the way through, right? Normally we say Judaism goes through the mother, not through the father. So if it goes to the mother, you can tell me as long as King David's mother is Jewish, it doesn't matter. But it does matter. Why? Because Ruth has to be Jewish over here. Because if she's not Jewish, and she still she's there's an opinion that says that Moabite gene gets passed down all the way through, so conversion doesn't help. Seemingly, conversion doesn't help, right? But what's the point? The point is, if you don't have oral law, then King David's status came into question, right? It did come into question, and therefore, what happened was that it got clarified. 100% it got clarified, but the law wasn't well known, right? So that's one of the reasons. That is one of the reasons that when it comes to the holiday of Shavuos, right? It is given in the Torah Mount Sinai, but it has to be. There was also oral law at the same time, because if there's no oral law, then I have a major problem, even for the Christians, because they want to show that their lineage also goes to King David, right? For JC and the Messiah and all that. But according to that, there's a major problem because the Torah itself says in the book of Deuteronomy, a Moabite can never enter the covenant. A Moabite can never convert, right? If a Moabite can never convert, then King David isn't Jewish. That's a problem. That's a serious problem. Yeah, so according to oral law, we have an answer. But if you don't come on to oral law, you got a major problem. You got a major question. So I had somebody dogging me for a long time. A long time, I'm not going to listen to the rabbis this, the rabbis that, the rabbis the other thing. So I asked him this question. I said, show me, and you don't want to believe in the rabbi, show me according to the Torah, according to the prophets, according to the writings, show me any verse or verses that will explain why Ruth is Jewish. Why Ruth is Jewish and King David is Jewish. Oh, they try to bring me this, bring me that. I mean, one of the things that make any sense. Yeah, and finally, I said, well, I know what the answer is. I said, the answer is going to come because of oral law. That's the only reason. Yeah, if you don't have oral law, you have a major problem here. Major problem here. The future Messiah of the Jewish people, and even according to, JC's coming back, has to go through the lineage of King David. Now, if JC is Jewish, which he was, yeah, then King David has to be Jewish. So then you got to go backtrack and say, okay, I got a problem. Ruth is a Moabite. And the Torah states clearly a Moabite can never enter the covenant. So if a Moabite can never enter the covenant, and King David has a problem being Jewish, what do you do with the future Messiah? Either way. Problem. Right? See, it's a problem. Right? So conversion is not explicit. It talks about convert. It talks about a convert. Doesn't say, the Torah does not say anything about what the process of conversion is. Does not say. Right? So you tell me, okay, so the rabbis made it up, and the rabbi said, okay, you have to do this, and you have to do that, and you have to know this, that, and the other thing. Okay, right? But every law in the Torah tells you, you are. I have no definitions. if I have no definitions, then I have to get the answer from somewhere. I have to get the information from somewhere, right? So they dictated what the guidelines are, right? But it's not written directly in the Torah, that's for sure, right? So Jewish bloodline of kingship are converts. It comes from King David. King David comes from Ruth, right? But I'll take it a step further. Where does Ruth come from? Yeah, who is Ruth's father or grandfather? Depends on the lineage here, but either the father or grandfather is Moab. The king of Moab, let's say better. The king of Moab. Ruth, 100%, everybody agrees, comes from Moab. Where did Moab come from? An incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. That's where Moab came from. So take it one step further, right? You're going to say, well, King David his great-great-grandmother was a convert. Yeah, it was a Moabite convert. Very good. And where did Ruth come from? From an incestuous relationship. Yeah, that's where Moab came from. From an incestuous relation. So essentially, the lineage of King David comes through a relationship between Lot and his daughters, an incestuous relationship, right? So then you got to ask the question: if this, this is one of the reasons you have to say the Torah is divine, because if you're talking about a future Messiah that's going to come, then looks really bad. Looks really bad if you're going to say, well, forget about a convert. We can live with we can live with a righteous convert. But you want to say that the origin, of Ruth is from an incestuous relationship, and she's going to be the progenitor of the future Messiah. First of all, the king of Israel, and the future Messiah later down the line. Who's going to write such a thing? Anyone who writes such a thing, that'd be blasphemy. Yeah, it's one thing to show, even like the patriarchs or whatever, like had certain flaws. Yeah. Not everyone's perfect. Okay, very good. So you tell me even the greatest people can have flaws. Okay. But you want to bank on the fact that your future Messiah, which hasn't come, and you're waiting to come, is based on an incestuous relationship? I mean, okay, there are deep things going on why that had to be. Right? Why you need, why it had to come from, such a relationship, whatever. Okay. But to say that, to say your future Messiah is going to change the world, and nations are going to live in peace, whoever survives, and all these great things. Jews are going to come back to Israel, rebuild the temple, and you're going to tell me the history of where they came from is at best dodgy. That's being nice. Yeah, they come from this type of relationship. Very hard to say, a man is going to write such a thing, and promote a religion, and it's a very serious part, of what Torah is. Okay, no one knows when the Messiah is going to come. No one knows how the Messiah is going to come. Everyone, will seem to agree we're living in the Messianic era, so we are close. Okay, so it is a pretty important thing, and certainly the Christians speak about it all the time, right? About their Messiah and all that. But both agree King David has to be Jewish. So even for JC to come back, which is not going to, but even for him to come back, yeah, you still have to say, according to his lineage, goes back to Ruth, which goes back to Lot and his daughters. Also looks bad. Whole thing looks bad, right? In general. But, there are kabbalistic reasons and potentially other reasons, why that is. But it's also a mind-boggling thing, right? It's also a mind-boggling thing. So the final Messiah will be a convert. No, not necessarily. Final Messiah has to be from the lineage of David. It has to be from the tribe of Judah, right? It could be a convert, in theory. A convert. Well, I don't know. Can they be a convert? 1 second. 1 second. Someone converts. What tribe are they from? Well, so they're not going to be a Kohen or a Levite, so that's for sure. So you don't have to worry about that. So could a convert be the Messiah? I guess in theory, yeah. Yeah, it could be. It could be. It doesn't have to be, right? But the whole point of Ruth being Ruth converts, right? Is you need Ruth in the process, obviously, to be the progenitor of King David. So King David's coming three generations later. So it could be. I don't know. It doesn't go against the fact that if you would say the Messiah has to come from the tribe of Levi, that the Messiah would have to be a Kohen or a Levite, yeah, that would be a problem because a convert's not going to be a Kohen or a Levite. So therefore, I mean, by that's not the case. So it doesn't matter. They have to come from the tribe of Yehuda. So a convert, in theory, yeah, it's not impossible, but it's certainly not impossible. Will it? Who knows? Nobody knows. Unconverts considered sons and daughters of Avram and Sarah, yes, but even if they're considered the son of Abraham and Sarah, right? Did Abraham come from the tribe of Yehuda? Abraham was before, right? Even if they are from Abraham and Sarah, even if they consider like Abraham and Sarah, okay, but the future Messiah at the end of the day has to come from the tribe of Yehuda, right? They have to come from the tribe of Yehuda, right? So a convert, I get this question a lot: how do we know what tribe we're from? We don't. Right? As long as a Jew, is not a is not a Kohen or a Levite, then they come from any of the tribes. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. That's one of the things that Elijah the prophet's going to do, right? He's gonna do all that. He's going to take care of that. Right? He's certainly going to he's certainly going to take care of that for sure. But even if they are like Avram and Sarah, right? They come, let's say, considered son of daughter of Avram and Sarah. That's not literal. Like when a person, called to the Torah, they'll be called Ben Avram, right? Let's say the son of Avram, right? Or when you pray for them, they'll be Ben Sarah, right? They consider like Sarah, okay, but not literally. Not literally. And the reason you're doing that, you're not saying like Rivka or Leah or Rachel. Why? Because they're the ones that reached out and worked with with everybody, trying to convince them that there's only one God, right? That's why they compared to, Avram and Sarah, but not literally because they don't have a tribe, right? What tribe Avram and Sarah from? They started the tree. Avram is the source, as the Ramchal says, right? Yitzhak and Yaakov are branches. Judaism stems from him, right? That's for sure. He taught them everything they need to know spiritually, and then through Yaakov and having so many kids and their offspring, whatever, eventually became the Jewish people. But they are going to be looked at as Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Israel. Who's Israel? Is Jacob. We don't say Ben Avram, right? In spiritual terms, they'd be like the son or daughter of Abraham, but not literally. We're not looking at it literally, looking at it in spiritual terms because of what Avram and Sarah did and what they brought to the world for the sake of convincing the world to be monotheistic, because everyone else was idol worshippers, So yeah, everyone had their pocket god. Here's Bob. Don't leave home without him. They all had their pocket god. They brought monotheism to the world. Absolute monotheism to the world. Right. So that's why they would be compared in that sense. Abraham was a convert himself. Well, what were the Jewish people? What they better? What were Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov before the Torah was given? Were they considered Jews or Noahites? If they're considered Jews, we have a lot of questions. We have many, many questions, right? Throughout the book of Genesis, right? One question you could ask by Yaakov: he's married to two sisters. That's forbidden. That's 100% forbidden. You have Tamar and Yehuda, right? Some say that they stayed together afterwards, father-in-law, daughter-in-law. That's the problem. There are a lot of issues. A lot of issues within the book of Genesis, whether people were considered, Jews or Jews or Noahites. So when they came to Mount Sinai, and obviously Abraham, Yitzhak, certainly, Yaakov and others weren't there. Their offspring were there, right? When they came to Mount Sinai, everyone's considered like converts, right? They're all considered like converts. Now, the Gemara says Abraham kept the Torah before it was given. Very good. He figured out in the world what God wanted him to do, right, etc. So, okay, whatever that means. But if you're going to say he kept the Torah before it was given, then who says he was a convert, right? You don't have to say he's a convert. You can say he was a Jew, right? It'd be much easier to say he was a Jew, but the question is what level of the mitzvahs did he keep? And that's a common theme. There's a book written, never been translated. I haven't gone through it. We should one day, right? That there's a book called, I think, Parshas Drachim. Parshas Drachim, I think, goes through like all these cases, right? And judges each case of, were they considered Jews or not, right? Or were they considered Jews or not, right? That is the question. Throughout the book, that's the question, right? That's always the question. So if the Gemara says, which it does, that Abraham is considered, Abraham kept the Torah, let's say better, kept the Torah before it was given, so do Isaac and Jacob, then I don't have to come on to the fact they converted. You don't hear anything about conversion there, right? They were Jews. They were considered Jews. Now, if they are considered Jews, then there are questions, right? There are a number of questions that you have to ask. If they're Jews, how could they have done this, that, and the other thing? So the question is, were they considered full Jews, or they only considered, I'm not going to say half Jews, but, let's say they kept Shabbos, but not all the negative commands of Shabbos, or whatever. It's not clear cut. It's not clear cut, right? What they are. But to say he was a convert, it's easier to say he was a Jew, right? If he kept the Torah before it was given, then okay. So he's only lacking going to Mount Sinai. So if he didn't go to Mount Sinai, okay, very good. So if he kept it, whatever level he kept it, so he can tell me he's a Jew. JC comes from King David. The Gospels, as far as I understand, have lineage. They have lineage trying to show that JC goes through King David, right? In other words, his lineage goes back to King David. The obvious problem is if you look at the different Gospels and you look at the list of going back to King David, the lists are not the same. There's inconsistency in the lists. I mean, that's one problem, but that's a big problem. In other words, if you're going to go back generation, go back to King David, you would think the lists of who he's going through and who he's related to is going to be the same. And if it's not the same, I got a problem. I got a lot of problems, but this would be a major problem here. Why are they not the same? That is one of the questions. I mean, one of the questions. I mean, many questions on the New Testament, but that's one of them. You got to be consistent. How can they have different names, different people? Either they're related to the people in front of them, or they weren't. And if they weren't, or there are different people mixed in, you got a problem. That you got that. I mean, there are a lot of problems, but that's a problem. I wouldn't say it's the main problem, but it's a problem, right? It's definitely a problem. You can't come along. Yeah, I mean, it's just too funny because you can't make this stuff up. You can't come along and say, well, we have, JC's lineage goes back to King David. Okay, prove it. Prove it comes back. Okay, we have three different lists. Very good. Very good. Let's evaluate the evidence. Let's look at the list. Yeah. Wow. It says over here, his great-great-great-great-grandmother, her name was, Sarah Schwartz. Very good. And one of them says no. Her name was, Bela Finkelstein or whoever, right? The names are not the same. How do you not have the names the same? That's a problem. So, maybe over time they made a mistake, and, you go back 2,000 years, so the records weren't so clear. If he's God or whatever, he doesn't make mistakes. Like in the Quran, for instance, they have, there were three people, the mentor says, there were three people involved in giving advice to Pharaoh. Yeah, what to do with the Jewish people. You had Bilam. Sorry, let's say you have Yisro, Moshe's father-in-law, right? And he said, you shouldn't enslave them, and he fled. You have Bilam, who said you should enslave them, and he was killed. You have Job, who didn't say anything. Because he didn't say anything, he got suffering. right? Because he didn't stick up for them, he didn't say anything, so he got suffering. Now, according to the Quran, one of those names is taken out. I forget which name is taken out, and they put in the name Haman. They put Haman in there as one of the three advisors for Pharaoh. Now, if you do the math, Haman was 1,000 years later. Yeah, at least 1,000 years later. Haman cannot be at that meeting. He cannot be at that meeting at all. It's impossible, right? So some tell me not. That's only the narrative. Yeah, if you're talking about God, God doesn't make mistakes like that, right? So that's a problem, right? That's again, there are other problems, but you don't make historical inaccuracies. Now, when someone pointed out some of these historical inaccuracies in the book, I think Permission to Believe by Rabbi Kelman. So he asked three questions to the Vatican. One of them was about Immaculate Conception. What about, I think, was this lineage to King David? And I forget there was a third question. But there was a discrepancy in history. So one of the higher ups of the Vatican, he prints the letter, said historical inaccuracies do not bother us. They don't bother us. Now, why don't they bother you? Either he was in such a place or he wasn't in such a place. This was his grandparents and they weren't his grandparents. In other words, if it's a divine book, divine books do not make mistakes. God does not make mistakes. Right? You can't make such an egregious mistake as 1,000-year difference. That's pretty bad. Right? There's another mistake also, in the Quran, where, talking about Miriam being Moshe Rabbeinu's sister, and also saying she was Miriam Magdalene. Right? I.e. JC's quote-unquote mother or whatever. That's no problem. That's historically totally inaccurate. I pointed these two things out to somebody, and they're like, no, it's not a problem. That's only the story. That's not part of you can't say it's part of the story. God doesn't make mistakes. It's a human error, a serious human error. Yeah, there are others also, but you can't make mistakes like that. And if you're going to go back to the, what do you call it? To the genealogy, of JC, and you have three different gospels giving you the information. How are they not the same? How are they not corroborated? Other people say names got lost. They put in this there. What do you mean? Either you have the right list or you don't. It's pretty simple, right? You're not trying to reinvent the wheel over here, right? You don't find a mistake in a book if it's supposed to be divine, right? Any mistake, God forbid in the Torah, you throw the whole thing out. Then it can't be true, right? All you have to do is find one inaccuracy. Yeah. Any other? Let's see. Any other questions here? One second. Let's see if I missed something here. Command to love converts 30 times. Yeah. We don't always do the right thing. But, anyone who's going to start up with converts and not do what they should do in different ways, God's going to take up their fight. Right? God's going to fight against them. Orphans are the same thing because they have no one to defend them. So God is going to take up the fight themselves. So why do some people not seem to care about that? I'm not going to answer for other people, as we always say. But you're right. It says more than 30 times, to love the convert, right? You can't afflict them. Very good. You're going to help them. So why are there people that don't? Why do people make it so hard in different things and they don't seem to care? And it's a problem. If you're doing it to test them, whatever, okay, there's a limit. There's a limit. But, but at the end of the day, keep in mind, you start up with them or an orphan or a widow. It's not like, it's not like the Torah says, well, you're going to have a hard time. This could happen or that could happen. The Torah makes very clear. You start up with them in the wrong way, God himself is going to fight against you. That means you're toast. That's what it means unless you seriously repent. Yeah? Because they have no one to defend themselves. Right? If you're starting up with someone who can't defend themselves in general, yeah, God says, I am going to start up with you. That's never a good idea. On your best day, that's not a good idea. And we see when, Titus opened his big mouth, it says, if you were so great, whatever, you wouldn't drown me in the sea. Fight me like a man, on dry land, the Gemara says. Right? God calls him out. God calls him out. Okay. So he makes him survive this storm and he puts him on dry land. So what does God do? How does God destroy him? He sticks a tremendously small insect, right? Smaller than a flea. It sticks it up his nose, right? And then it grows and grows and grows. It was like eating away at his brain, right? Different things that happen to him. So Titus says, oh, if you're so powerful, fight me on dry land. God said, I got the smallest creature in the world, the smallest flea. I'm going to destroy you, in so many different ways. A tiny thing that's going to make your life a misery. So, oh, you're so strong, fight me. By the way, you kidding? I can do anything. I can do anything in the world. So what does he do? He takes the smallest thing. He takes the flea, sticks it up his nose, and causes havoc. When he dies, they see this, bird, like, very big, this huge bird with like, unbelievably sharp teeth was like, growing in his brain. It went from a flea to turn into that. But like, he had headaches all the time and, other things happened, but he took a small thing. Oh, fight me, fight me fair. Don't drown me. God says, okay. I got a lot of weapons to use. I use a flea. I use a small, this small thing, and this is what's going to happen. That's what happened. That's what the Gemara says. That's what the Gemara says. At one point, he found he had headaches like all the time because this bird or whatever was gnawing, gnawing in his brain. So he found once he was walking by a blacksmith, and the blacksmith was was banging down, and pain stopped. So he spent a lot of time by a blacksmith, so he wouldn't have this pain. But eventually, the Gemara says the pain came back because eventually this creature, whatever it was, right, got too used to it. So then it went back to doing what it was doing. So he didn't have respite for very long, right? So as just one example. You do not want to start up, with God over here. Like, God can do, absolutely anything. He can take the tiniest thing and just like destroy a person, like he did with Titus, right? So if a person starts up with orphans, widows, right, causes them pain, right, or converts, the Torah makes very clear, it's not just going to be bad. It's not just going to be hard. It's not going to just be you're punished. That wouldn't be so bad. Yeah, but what does the Torah say? The Torah says God himself is going to fight their cause. That is never good, right? That is never good if you do something against them. Because God himself is going to fight you. You know what happens when God fights you? I'm not going to say you're going to die. You are going to suffer like no tomorrow. Yeah, and you'll never win. It's like not even close. Right? Not even close. So, why people aren't maybe not so careful in this? Good question. Right? It's a good question. Some people think they can say what they want and whatever, and, they don't think there are repercussions. The Torah makes very clear what the repercussions are. Yeah? God himself is going to fight against. So, that's always bad. Right? That is, it's good in other ways, but, the person who started up is going to be 100% bad for them. Somebody asked, 1 second. When you say to love converts, doesn't mean JIT. No, they're not a convert. JIT is not a convert. JIT is in the process. Okay. Right. At some point, if the person can, they should help them. Right. We're talking about a Jew. Now, it doesn't mean a person should start up with non-Jews either. Right. It also doesn't look good. Right. But we're talking specifically about a convert. Someone asks, when you say about Abraham being a convert, and we're all going for the same thing, converting our hearts to follow God. What did I say? So I said that there's a question, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, if they kept the Torah before it was given, then the question is, were they considered Jews or non-Jews? Were they considered, Jews or Noahites? That was the question, right? But they didn't get to Mount Sinai, so if the Gemara says they were considered, they kept the Torah before it was given. Now the question is, okay, were they really considered Jews? Or let's say certain aspects of Shabbos they didn't do because they weren't totally Jewish or whatever. So that's the question. What were the Jewish people before they gave the Torah Mount Sinai? What were they considered? Were they considered Jews or were they considered Noahites? So that's the question by Avraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. Right? What were they considered? Jews or Noahites? And if they're considered Jews, you got a lot of questions. Throughout the book of Genesis, you got a lot of questions. That was the issue. Right? You'll definitely have a lot of questions. Because there's some things they can't do if they're Jewish. Yeah, any other questions? All right, I'm going to stop here. I do this every Tuesday and Thursday. 10 o'clock Eastern time, 4 o'clock Israel time for the next 2 weeks.
Stay safe, my friend.
We're going to try. We are trying. So anyone has any questions, you can find me on Facebook at Michael Kaufman, Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism, orthodoxconversion.com. Beyond Orthodox Conversion Judaism on YouTube. There you can find videos on Q&As. That's our Father's Book of Leviticus. You want to send me an email, rabbichaimkaufman@gmail.com, RBBICHIM, COFFMAN@gmail.com. Wish I'm good. It's beginning of the day, middle of the day, end of the day.